So, Mr. Shea, thank you for joining us from Brussels. 2 days ago, Serbia requested that it brings back its troops to Kosovo. It asked this request from NATO. Could you imagine this would happen 22 years later?
The answer is no. I would not have expected this request to come in because KFOR has the responsibility for security in Kosovo under the UN Security Council Resolution 1244. And since June 1999, KFOR has been doing that job very, very well indeed in ensuring the environments of security for everybody. So there's absolutely no need for Serb troops to go back to Kosovo. It wouldn't solve any problems. It would only escalate the situation. And therefore, I expect KFOR, having studied the request from Belgrade, to say thank you very much, but no, we're handling this very well. KFOR has recently increased its presence in the north of the country, particularly to deal with the situation regarding the barricades. And as I've said, I think that Serbia should leave it to KFOR and the EU ULEX police and the Kosovo authorities to restore calm to the situation.
Nevertheless, it's been almost 2 weeks since the barricades in the north have been raised. And not that this hasn't happened before, but we find that this is dramatic, the most dramatic moment since the declaration of independence, in a sense that the barricades have been allowed to stay there for too long. Now, Kosovo Albanians expect KFOR to remove them. KFOR is in no hurry. What do you think should be done in a situation like this?
Well, I know that KFOR has every intention of removing the barricades, and as I've said, my understanding is that KFOR has deployed additional forces together with the ULEX police in the north to increase the security presence. Today also, the head of NATO's Joint Forces Command in Naples, which has overall responsibility for Kosovo, he's Admiral Stuart Mush. He's in Belgrade seeing President Vučić, and I imagine he will also be asking President Vučić to de-escalate the situation and call for calm. So I imagine the KFOR strategy is, yes, to remove the barricades, but to do it in a quiet, step-by-step, non-escalatory way, not provoking any more violence, particularly during this Christmas New Year period, because that's better than some kind of big show of force, which would only produce more violence. We've had enough of that already. Nobody wants more of that. So let's leave it to KFOR to adopt a sensible strategy, step-by-step, to removing the barricades.
How much longer do you think Kosovo should be patiently waiting for this? How much longer?
Well, we have in English this expression, which is how long is a piece of string, which basically means it's very difficult to say. But my sense is that it's best to do it step by step. It's best to do it quietly, not to provoke any more violence, not to give Belgrade any further pretexts to say, like the Prime Minister of Serbia said yesterday, that we're on the cusp of war. This is not true. This is over-dramatic language. So the quiet, deliberate way of KFOR, as I've said, is the way to go. And I know it's frustrating for the Kosovars, but de-escalating the violence, getting the Brussels dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina back on track, moving forward, that's in the interest of Kosovo, not prolonging this stalemated situation in the north.
But at the moment, it looks like it's pretty much of a standstill because a week ago, there were some diplomats visiting Kosovo, trying to intermediate. Right now, there's no political dialogue happening or mediation that we see of. The Brussels talks that were supposed to happen this week have been postponed. So is there really something, should we expect that diplomacy would resolve this? If we don't see it happening in the front, does it mean it's happening in the background? We're just not seeing it?
Well, first of all, I mentioned that NATO's engaged. The head of NATO's Joint Forces Command is in Belgrade today, so NATO is definitely on top of the situation with the increased presence in the north. Secondly, we've had, I think, lots of diplomacy over the last couple of weeks. We've had the Franco-German plan now for facilitating the recognition of Kosovo by Serbia. That's a positive sign. We've had the engagement, of course, of the United States with Ambassador Escobar in the region as well. We've also seen with the summit of the European Union in Albania just a couple of days ago with the Western Balkans, a strong push towards broadening EU enlargement and EU engagement with the region. We've seen more calls from EU countries on Serbia to implement the sanctions against Russia, for example. And we've had, I think, this very positive step of Prime Minister Kurti going to Prague just a few days ago to deposit with the EU Kosovo's application to join the European Union. So there is a diplomatic sort of track which is moving forward. But yes, you're right to the extent that we first of all have to deal with this current situation in the north and de-escalate that, have calm so that we can focus not on the immediate crisis situation, but on the long-term diplomatic track.
I agree with you. There's a bit more engagement than ever before. But at the same time, how do you comment on the fact that the Franco-German plan was rejected by Minister Dačić of Serbia? That plan, which involves many other things, but also recognition, de facto or de jure, of Kosovo's independence, has been rejected initially.
Well, it's been sort of criticised inevitably, I suppose, because anything that doesn't give one side everything it wants is always criticised. But it's President Vučić, of course, and the Prime Minister who speak on behalf of the government rather than an individual minister or a Serb member of parliament. So let's sort of wait and see. And of course, any plan is open for negotiation. It's open for modification. But it does represent a concrete way forward. My understanding is inevitably the Serb side wants to link the Franco-German plan to former elements of agreement by the EU, for example, on the creation of this Association of Serb Municipalities, which has been, of course, approved previously by the Kosovo Parliament. So yes, there will be a kind of negotiation, but I wouldn't be as gloomy as you simply because this plan has picked up some criticism in Belgrade to say that Serbia rejected it entirely. I think it's a very good basis for moving forward, and I hope after the Christmas New Year holiday, when hopefully we'll have calm in Kosovo and on the border, no more right-wing Serb radicals hopefully trying to seize border posts, that kind of thing, that we can then sort of move forward more rationally.
Interesting that you're optimistic, but I wanted you to comment on the fact that the right-wing groups have been encouraged by the Russia-Ukraine war. They feel there is space. Clearly, there's never been a request for troops to come back to Kosovo, Serbian troops. Now there is, at least it's become acceptable to do that in international diplomacy. While there is engagement on one side, don't you think that the context of Russia-Ukraine war has revealed what Kosovars knew already, that Serbians' public authentic sentiment lies with Russia, that Serbia does support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and all of us are somehow wanting to see a different Serbia, but are we not recognizing that this situation is such that we need to accept that Serbia will remain quite pro-Russian sentimented state?
Yeah, it's a good question. My sense is Serbia is a divided country. It's not that it's in the Russian camp or in the Chinese camp. It's simply that it wants to be in all camps at once, which is a convenient position, right? Trade with Russia on energy, trade with China on technology and weapons, while at the same time pursuing EU membership. The fact of the matter is that Serbia's trade is overwhelmingly with the EU, not with Russia and China. Opinion polls showing particularly that the younger generation in Serbia looks to the EU. And Alexander Vučić has said that, the EU is where his country wants to go. So in a way, sooner or later, yes, you're right, Serbia has to make a choice. It can't be in the camp of the democracies and the camp of the authoritarians at the same time. It can't remain sitting on the fence. But I've always said that if it looks at its fundamental interests in trade and security, they are overwhelmingly with the European Union. And I think in the last couple of days, for example, I noticed an interview by the German ambassador to Belgrade yesterday. The EU partners of Serbia are pointing out, look, this sitting on the fence has got to stop. If you want to be a European country, you have to start acting and behaving like a European country. So my sense is that it's not that Serbia is totally with Russia. It's simply that it's a divided country that likes to be in all camps at once.
But Serbia would say that is acceptable in the EU. Look at Orban. It's possible to be in both camps, and eventually EU will tolerate this behavior because they did it so far. They accepted Russian military help, formed a niche humanitarian center funded by Russia, and EU continued to provide the majority of funding to Serbia. So there's no fallback to being in both camps.
My sense, again, a good question, but my sense, the way that the EU behaves is that the more Serbia negotiates the various chapters, the 35 chapters of EU membership, it's still at a quite early stage of the process. The more the EU is going to stress the conditionality that the completion of the process of EU membership has to go with the respect of the rule of law, the respect of European values, for instance, the respect of press freedoms and the like. And of course, as I've said many times, the recognition of Kosovo, the recognition and the normalization of relations with all of its neighbors. We saw in the case of Croatia, which was the last country to join the EU in 2013, that the closer Croatia got to actually finalizing EU membership, the more, for example, it was under pressure to hand over war criminals. For example, Ante Gotovina, one of the last major indicted war criminals to be handed over as well. So my sense is that the EU conditionality will become more strenuous for Serbia the closer it gets to the actual date of EU accession, which of course is not going to happen tomorrow.
I understand that, but while from the outside you're all expecting normalization of agreement, on the field Serbia is requesting 1,000 troops to come back to Kosovo. Is it also possible that the entire conflict goes the wrong way, despite good expectations? Should we prepare for that?
Yeah, I mean, KFOR is definitely prepared and has been reinforced by NATO. And of course, NATO is looking very closely at the situation. The Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, is in constant contact with Prime Minister Kurti, with President Vučić, as are the EU leaders, as is the United States. So the international community is not sleeping at the wheel, if you like, during this crisis. But I think also when you talk about Serbia wanting to put troops back into Kosovo, my sense is that Belgrade would have known very, very well that the answer would be no, that these troops are not needed, and therefore sort of put in a request where it knew what the answer would be in advance, probably simply for a political demonstration, maybe to try to send a message to the Kosovo Serb population that Belgrade was supporting their desire to sort of distance themselves from Pristina. We can speculate, but I don't honestly see that this was ever intended as a serious move, more as a political signal.
From where you're sitting, we spoke about how do you see Serbia so far, but what is Kosovo doing right or wrong in this situation? And what could Kosovo be doing more?
Well, I think the first thing is, of course, leaving it to KFOR and ULEX, which is what is happening with close cooperation, is the way to go in de-escalating. Number two, I think Prime Minister Kurti made a good move in postponing the decision on the license plates. I myself, in many interviews, have said that it's quite normal that Kosovo would want a universal system of license plates. Every European country has a universal system of car license plates for a number of practical reasons. But the EU and the United States were asking Prime Minister Kurti to postpone the implementation of that decision. He did so. Similarly, of course, Kosovo lifted the 100% tariffs on Serb goods some time ago to de-escalate the situation. Prime Minister Kurti has also been in Brussels, of course, trying to get with Alexander Vučić this dialogue back on track. I also think, as I've said, that Prime Minister Kurti going to Prague and introducing the formal application of Kosovo to join the European Union points to the direction of travel. And I would hope that Alexander Vučić would recognize that EU aspiration of Serbia and support that EU aspiration of Serbia as well, because I think in terms of normalization, these two countries in the EU is the ultimate solution. So as long as he works for de-escalation, he works for calm and diplomacy, I think Prime Minister Kurti will have the support of both NATO and the European Union.
Locally here in Kosovo, there's public pressure on this government to remove the barricades themselves if KFOR doesn't do it. Do you think that's a good idea? Opposition is asking Mr. Kurti to establish sovereignty in the north and have the police remove them, as police is in charge of freedom of movement, Kosovo police. Do you think that's a good idea for Kosovo police to push through if KFOR hesitates?
Again, coming back to what I said at the beginning of our discussion, leave it to KFOR. For every challenge, there are always two solutions. There's one, to go in dramatic way, shock tactics, if you like, which only escalates the situation, gives the radicals an excuse to create more violence, and you end up in a worse situation than you were before. Over hasty and not very well thought through. There's always a second approach, which is to do things in an organized, methodical way, step by step, barricade by barricade, without creating violence, which returns the situation to normal. And as you can probably imagine, I'm an advocate of the intelligent solution rather than, the dramatic effect, shock tactic type solution. So let's just be patient. KFOR is responsible for security. KFOR has said that even if it requires a little bit more time, I saw today that KFOR told the government in Pristina that it needs a little bit more time, but leave it to KFOR, leave it to the international community. That is by far the best approach.
Now, majority of people watching us tonight know you as the man of information in times of crisis. And I want to give a bit more context to this, how information, disinformation have been playing a key role right now. In this program, we've had local Serbs speaking of scares and a paranoia that Kosovo police is coming out there to arrest normal citizens and the population. There's a scares that Kosovo police is coming to invade and establish a police state in the north. This is a kind of disinformation, even without going out in the media, is being spread as rumor in the north. And these are the impressions of Kosovo Serbs living there that they share with us. Now, what is your advice how to deal with this disinformation in times of crisis?
Well, I think you're asking there really the fundamental question. You're right. When I was the spokesman of NATO back in the 1990s, social media was just being invented. So we didn't have all of these social media sites where people could post any kind of nonsense or rubbish. We were able to communicate directly to people via television, via newspapers. It was a lot easier. But now you're absolutely right. Now, 25 years later, we're in the age of the social media. And there's a lot of Russian disinformation, Serb disinformation out there. For example, on the license plates, people in the north were convinced that if they had to have a normal national Kosovo license plate, somehow this was a kind of violation of their freedoms. Complete nonsense. So we need, of course, the government of Kosovo in Pristina to send and articulate a clear message and to immediately act to rebut, to debunk, to refute this information. Clear communications, very, very, very quickly. And of course, also in the Serbian language, as well as in Albanian as well. We need, of course, to take action against sites that clearly are calling for violence, inciting hatred, and also spreading lies and falsehoods as well. That's going to be key too. The international community needs to play its part in all of this. I said before, when the decision was made to postpone the application of the license plates, that what the government of Kosovo needs to do was to conduct an information campaign, explaining clearly to people in the north that the license plate issue is practical. It's not political. It's a question of being able to have a register of vehicles, to check the safety of vehicles, to make sure that people pay tax, because people have to pay tax on cars. Otherwise, how can you have good roads? Of course, it's linked to that. To check the safety of the vehicles, to make sure that they're still safe to be on the roads. All kinds of practical reasons. But this information campaign was not conducted ahead of the decision. So let's have the information campaigns before decisions are taken to explain why the decisions are going to be taken, and not have the information campaign as a reactive element after the decision has been taken. But you're right. Unfortunately, we do live in the world of disinformation. Unfortunately, the Serb minority in the north of Kosovo is very, you're quite correct, very vulnerable, very susceptible to this type of disinformation. So we need to see what we can do, maybe to establish, I don't know, more Serbian language radio stations, TV stations, town hall meetings, whatever, but we need a much more effective information campaign because this disinformation is being used to create separatism and is being used to justify violence. So it's not neutral, it's an element of warfare, hybrid warfare, and we have to deal with it vigorously.
You are right in that so far the Kosovo government has not communicated enough in Serbian to the local population, but in the north. But if it wants to do that, again, how does one do it when the Serbs have access to Serbian media and are watching a very tensed and disinformed Serbian TV channels, which are also reporting a very pro-Russian version of the war in Ukraine? Hours of the Russian version of the war in Ukraine. That atmosphere remains almost similar to the 90s, the disinformation that the Serbs are getting. So how does Kosovo government reach out to a population that is glued to Belgrade media?
Well, you're right. It's not easy. And you can't, unfortunately, transform the situation overnight. But the first thing is to offer an alternative. Number two, of course, those more moderate Serbs who live not just, of course, north of Mitrovica, but elsewhere in Kosovo, and who are in the parliament. I know many Serbs, unfortunately, for the time being, have left the administration or the police because of the situation in the north. But those more moderate, more integrated members of the Serb community in Kosovo also have a responsibility to tell their fellow Serb citizens in Kosovo, what the reality is. Of course, that's going to be very important as well. Local engagement is important. As I mentioned, town hall meetings, round tables, working through NGOs and citizens organizations, which sometimes have a greater trust at the local level than in the government, working with the mayors and all the like. That is effective as well. Of course, where the Serb media come up with things that patently are false and irresponsible and could escalate violence, it's important not just to let that go, but to immediately rebut it, present the facts, using intelligence information, sometimes using video. For example, the United States in Ukraine managed to combat Putin's narrative by effectively releasing a lot of photography, a lot of intelligence material to show that Putin was lying. That kind of effort as well, in terms of releasing material that shows who's telling the truth here, is important as well. So you're right, there's no silver bullet, there's no magic formula, particularly when a population have been subjected to only a very partisan view of the world for a long time. But that's not a reason for demobilization either. People can be active on the social media to tell the truth, just as they can be active in terms of falsehood. It's simply that we need a much better organized, better funded and more coherent joint campaign between the government of Kosovo and the international community to make sure that we're communicating truth and rebutting falsehood. It can be done.
Okay. Lastly, we spoke about what Serbian government expectation, what you would like to see them do in terms of EU integration, what you'd like to see Kosovo government do. But what is your view and what are lessons learned for Western and international diplomacy now that we're in the middle, maybe towards the end of a Russia-Ukraine war, but a new war in Europe, which was hardly imagined that we would have in 2022. What are the lessons learned there, and what should the Western diplomacy do about Kosovo and Serbia in this context?
Well, my sense is two things. I mean, first of all, it's the unity of the West. Pushing back against Russia. You've seen NATO and the EU more united than ever over the last year in helping Ukraine resist successfully the Russian aggression, supplying weapons to Kiev, supplying finance, coping with the refugees, reinforcing NATO's defense has been a big effort. As long as people in the Balkans see that the Western democracy is resilient, is not giving in, is pushing back, that ultimately with sanctions, it's the authoritarians who are losing, it's their populations who are suffering because of this aggression, then I think we're going in the right direction. The democracies have to show that at the end of the day, it's their values, not the values of aggression, that are going to prevail. The second thing is re-engaging with the Western Balkans, which were neglected, let's be frank, for a while. The EU process was frozen. Countries like Bosnia were not being given candidate status. We spoke earlier, there was paralysis in the Brussels dialogue between Belgrade and Kosovo. Belgrade was not coming under sufficient pressure as it wants to move to the EU to adopt EU values and standards. But with this summit in Albania a couple of days ago, the EU and the Western Balkans, with the creation of this European political community by the European countries that bring in all of the countries in Eastern Europe, the candidate countries, we are now seeing a new political momentum. And as long as that momentum continues, then I think the magnetic pull on both Belgrade and Pristina to move towards Brussels will be very, very strong. But we can't take our eye off the ball. Unfortunately, much to my disappointment, 25 years after the conflict of 1999, we're not seeing the progress that I would have hoped for. And it shows that this big diplomatic effort to prevent crises, to prevent violence, to keep the diplomatic track alive, this effort has to be maintained all the time. You unfortunately cannot yet leave it to the local leaders. They need a lot of international support if they're going to be able to move forward.
Mr. Shea, thank you a lot for remaining engaged. Your voice with historical memory you have of Kosovo conflict still means a lot to the people watching. thanks for keeping engaged.
Well, thank you again for inviting me on today. A real pleasure to speak to you. I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and more success in 2023.
Merry Christmas to you too. Happy New Year. Thank you.